At 6:40 on the morning of September 22nd, 1943, Second Lieutenant Ernest Childers lay flat on his stomach in a muddy ditch outside the village of Oliveto, Italy, listening to German machine gun fire rake the hillside above him, while pain from a broken foot radiated up through his entire right leg. 25 years old, a full-blooded Creek Indian from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. The son of a people who had already survived one war of extermination, fought against them by the very government whose uniform he now wore. His company had been advancing up a series of terraced hills southeast of the village when German defenders opened fire from fortified positions along the ridgeline. 2 machine gun nests and at least 1 mortar observation post controlled the approaches. Every attempt to move forward had been driven back by concentrated fire that swept the open slopes. Childers had broken his foot, stepping into a shell crater during the initial advance. The hole had been concealed by tall grass, and he had gone in at a full stride. His right ankle had twisted violently, and the small bones along the outside of his foot had snapped with a sound he could hear even above the gunfire. The pain had dropped him to the ground. A medic had examined the foot and told him he needed to go to the rear for treatment. Childers had refused. The 45th Infantry Division had been fighting in Italy for exactly 12 days. They had landed at Salerno on September 10th as part of the Allied invasion force, wading ashore under German artillery fire that turned the beaches into killing grounds. The division had pushed inland through the mountains south of Naples, fighting for every ridge, every village, every stretch of road that the Germans chose to defend. The terrain was a defender's paradise. Steep hills covered in brush and olive groves. Stone villages perched on hilltops that had served as fortifications since the Roman Empire. Narrow valleys where a single, well-placed machine gun could hold an entire battalion at bay. The Germans knew how to use this terrain. They had been retreating north through Italy since the Allied landings in Sicily in July, conducting a fighting withdrawal that traded space for time while inflicting maximum casualties. Every hill was defended. Every withdrawal was covered by machine guns and mortars. Every American advance was paid for in blood. The story of Ernest Childers begins not in Italy, but in the red dirt country of eastern Oklahoma, where the Creek Nation had been living since the United States government forced them from their ancestral lands in Alabama and Georgia during the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. The removal had killed thousands. Entire families had died on the march west, from exposure, disease, starvation, and the casual brutality of soldiers who viewed them as something less than human. The survivors had rebuilt their nation in Indian Territory, establishing towns, farms, schools, and a government that preserved Creek culture and language in a land they had never chosen. Ernest Childers was born on September 1st, 1918, in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. His parents were full-blooded Creek. They spoke the Muskogee language at home. They observed Creek traditions and ceremonies that had survived the removal, the Civil War, the allotment era, and every other attempt by the federal government to erase their identity. The Childers family was poor. Oklahoma in the 1920s and 1930s was a hard place for anyone. For Native Americans, it was harder. The oil wealth that had made some Oklahomans rich had largely bypassed the Creek communities. Jobs were scarce. Opportunities were scarcer. The Depression hit Indian country with particular cruelty because there was less to lose and fewer resources to fall back on. Childers grew up in this environment. He attended Chilocco Indian Agricultural School, a federal boarding school for Native American children in north-central Oklahoma. The boarding school system was designed to assimilate Native children into white American culture. Students were forbidden to speak their native languages. Their hair was cut. Their traditional clothing was confiscated. They were taught English, Christianity, and vocational skills deemed appropriate for Indians. The schools produced generations of Native Americans who could navigate both worlds, who spoke English and their native tongues, who understood white culture without abandoning their own. Childers was one of these. He learned English fluently. He excelled at agriculture and manual skills. He also maintained his Creek identity, his language, his connection to a people who had survived everything that history had thrown at them. In 1937, at the age of 19, Childers enlisted in the Oklahoma National Guard. His reasons were practical. The Guard paid money. Money was scarce. A young Creek man in Depression-era Oklahoma had limited options. The military offered food, shelter, clothing, and a small paycheck. It also offered something less tangible, but equally important: respect. Childers was assigned to the 45th Infantry Division, a National Guard division drawn primarily from Oklahoma, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. The 45th was unique among American military units. Its ranks included a disproportionate number of Native Americans, from the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, Comanche, Apache, and Navajo nations. The division's original insignia had been a swastika, a traditional Native American symbol representing good luck and the four directions. When Hitler adopted the same symbol for his Nazi party, the 45th Division changed its insignia to the Thunderbird, another Native American symbol. The Thunderbird would become one of the most recognized division patches of the war. The 45th Division was activated for federal service in September 1940. The training was intense. Infantry tactics, weapons qualification, physical conditioning, field exercises that lasted weeks. Childers proved himself a natural soldier. He was physically tough, a product of a childhood spent working on Oklahoma farms and ranches. He was an excellent marksman with the M1 Garand rifle. He understood terrain instinctively, reading the landscape with an eye that his Creek ancestors would have recognized. His superiors noticed. Childers was promoted steadily through the enlisted ranks: corporal, sergeant, staff sergeant. Each promotion came because he earned it, through demonstrated competence and leadership. In an army that still harbored significant racial prejudice, Childers carved out a reputation based purely on ability. Childers received a battlefield commission during this period, promoted from enlisted man to second lieutenant. The commission was based on his performance in training and his demonstrated ability to lead men. Someone in the chain of command had recognized that Ernest Childers possessed qualities that went beyond what training exercises could measure. The 45th Division shipped overseas in the spring of 1943. Their destination was North Africa, the staging area for the Allied invasion of Sicily. Operation Husky would be the 45th Division's first combat and the first major amphibious assault conducted by American forces in the European theater. The division landed on the southern coast of Sicily on July 10, 1943. The landing was opposed by Italian and German defenders, who fired on the assault waves from fortified positions along the beaches. Childers and his company waded ashore through surf that ran red with the blood of men killed by artillery and machine gun fire. Sicily was a brutal introduction to combat. The island's mountainous terrain favored the defenders at every turn. The heat was punishing, temperatures exceeding 100 degrees in the interior. Water was scarce. German and Italian forces conducted skilled defensive operations, delaying the Allied advance while extracting their main forces across the Strait of Messina. Childers fought through Sicily for 38 days. He led his platoon through firefights in olive groves and village streets. He learned the sounds of combat, the distinctive crack of a Mauser rifle, the ripping sound of an MG-42, the whistle and crash of mortar rounds. He learned how men behaved under fire, which ones could be relied on, and which ones would freeze. He earned his first combat decorations in Sicily, establishing a pattern that would reach its climax on a hillside near Oliveto. The Allied invasion of mainland Italy began on September 3rd, 1943. The main American landing came at Salerno on September 9th, a large-scale amphibious assault that nearly ended in disaster when German counterattacks threatened to push the invasion force back into the sea. The 45th Division landed at Salerno on September 10th. The beachhead was still under intense German pressure. Artillery and mortar fire pounded the landing areas. The division moved inland immediately, pushing through the confusion of the beachhead into the mountains south of Naples. The terrain around Oliveto was typical of the Italian campaign. A series of terraced hills rose to the southeast of the village, planted with olive trees and grapevines in peacetime, now scarred by shell craters. The hills offered excellent defensive positions. Any force holding the high ground could observe and fire on movement for miles in every direction. The Germans held the high ground. They had established at least 2 machine gun positions and a mortar observation post on the ridgeline above Oliveto. The machine guns were the MG-42, the weapon that American soldiers called Hitler's Buzz saw for the distinctive sound it made when firing at its maximum rate of 1,200 rounds per minute. Childers' Company, Company C of the 180th Infantry Regiment, had been ordered to advance up the hills and clear the German positions. The attack began in the pre-dawn darkness of September 22nd. The company moved out in platoon columns, climbing the terrace slopes toward the ridgeline. The advance went well for the first hour. The company climbed without encountering resistance, moving through olive groves in the gray light of early morning. The silence was deceptive. The Germans were waiting for the Americans to reach a point where they could not easily retreat. At 6:30, the company reached a point approximately 300 yards from the ridgeline. The terrain opened up ahead. There was no cover to speak of. Any man who moved across that open ground would be visible to the defenders on the ridge. That was when the Germans opened fire. The machine guns erupted simultaneously. 2 MG-42s firing at their maximum rate created a wall of sound and steel that swept across the advancing Americans. Men went down immediately. Some were hit. Others dropped instinctively, pressing themselves into the ground as bullets cracked overhead. The advance stopped, as if a switch had been thrown. Mortar rounds began falling moments later. The observer on the ridge had the Americans' position marked. Shells began walking across the terraces. Each explosion threw dirt, stone fragments, and shrapnel in all directions. Men who had found cover from the machine guns were now exposed to the mortars. Childers was moving forward when his right foot found the shell crater. His foot went in at an angle, his body's momentum carrying him forward while his ankle twisted violently. He heard the bones break. The pain was immediate and intense, a sharp, white-hot flash that radiated from his foot up through his shin. A medic reached him within minutes. The boot had to stay on because removing it would allow swelling that would make it impossible to put back on. The medic told Childers the foot was broken and he needed evacuation. Childers looked up the hill. His men were pinned down. The machine guns were firing continuously. Mortar rounds were falling among his soldiers. Nobody was moving forward. Nobody could move forward. He told the medic to wrap the foot as tightly as possible and leave him. The medic wrapped the foot, cinching the bandage tight inside the boot to provide support for the broken bones, and moved on to treat other casualties. Childers lay in the ditch, assessing the situation. His company commander had been trying to coordinate a flanking movement, but the terrain did not allow it. Artillery support was unavailable. The division's artillery was committed elsewhere. Company C was on its own. The German positions had to be eliminated by infantry action, or the company would remain pinned on the exposed slope, taking mortar casualties until they were forced to withdraw. Childers made a decision that would define his life. He would go up the hill himself. He did not announce his intention. He did not ask permission. He did not call for volunteers. He simply began crawling forward, alone, dragging his broken foot behind him through the dirt and brush of the Italian hillside. The pain was extraordinary. Every movement of his right leg sent waves of agony through the broken bones. Crawling requires pushing with the legs as well as pulling with the arms. Each push drove the broken edges of bone against each other inside his boot. Childers crawled through it. He had learned to manage pain growing up in Oklahoma, where life on creek farms and ranches provided plenty of opportunities for injury. Pain was familiar. Pain was something that happened to the body while the mind continued doing what needed to be done. He moved through the brush along the left side of the slope, using scattered rocks and low vegetation for concealment. The machine guns were focused on the main body of his company. The gunners were not watching for a single man crawling through the brush on their flank. The crawl took nearly 30 minutes, 300 yards of broken ground, rock walls, brush, and open patches that had to be crossed with agonizing slowness to avoid detection. Childers moved during the moments when the machine guns were firing, using the noise to cover any sound he made. He reached a position approximately 30 yards from the first machine gun nest. He could see it clearly now. 2 German soldiers manning the gun, a third feeding the ammunition belt. They were dug into a shallow position, reinforced with stones and sandbags. Childers unslung his M1 Garand rifle and checked the 8-round clip. He was carrying additional ammunition and several hand grenades. The M1 Garand was accurate at 10 times the distance. At 30 yards, Childers could put a round through a man's eye socket. He aimed at the gunner first. The man behind the gun was the most immediate threat. Kill the gunner and the gun goes silent. The M1 Garand cracked once. The gunner slumped sideways. The assistant gunner reached for the weapon. Childers fired again. The second man went down. The ammunition feeder threw himself flat behind the sandbags. Childers fired a third time through the gap in the stones. The third German stopped moving. 1 machine gun eliminated. Childers ejected the partially spent clip and loaded a fresh one. He could hear shouting from the second machine gun position, further along the ridge. The crew there had heard the rifle shots, but could not see Childers from their position. Childers began crawling again. His foot was beyond pain now. It had entered a realm of sensation that transcended normal suffering. The bones were grinding with every movement. Swelling inside the boot was creating pressure that felt like his foot was being crushed. He moved along the ridgeline toward the second machine gun position. The crawl was shorter this time, perhaps 80 yards, but every yard cost him more than the last. His arms were tiring. His broken foot caught on rocks and roots, sending jolts of pain through his body. He reached a point 20 yards from the second machine gun nest. This position was better constructed, built into a natural depression, with stones piled around the edges. 2 Germans manned the gun. Others were nearby in individual fighting positions, riflemen providing security. Childers could not approach as closely as he had to the first position. The terrain was more open. The riflemen had clear sight lines in multiple directions. If he tried to crawl closer, they would spot him. He decided to use grenades. He pulled one from his belt, yanked the pin, and threw it in a high arc toward the machine gun position. The grenade landed behind the parapet and detonated among the crew. Stone fragments and shrapnel sprayed outward. Childers was on his feet immediately, or as close to his feet as his broken foot would allow. He hobbled forward, rifle raised, firing at the figures visible in and around the destroyed position. He hit the machine gunner. He hit a rifleman rising from his fighting hole. He fired at another shape moving in the smoke. The second machine gun was silenced, but the mortar observer was still operational somewhere further up the ridge. As long as he remained in communication with the mortar crews behind the hill, shells would continue falling on the pinned American company below. The observer had to be found and eliminated. Childers could hear mortar rounds still impacting on the terraces below him. He scanned the terrain above, looking for telltale signs of an observation post, a man with binoculars, a radio antenna, a position with clear line of sight. He saw movement, perhaps 50 yards further up the slope, partially concealed behind a rock outcropping. A German soldier was kneeling with binoculars pressed to his eyes. A field telephone lay on the ground beside him. 50 yards uphill on a broken foot. Childers looked at the distance and began climbing. He could not crawl on this section. The angle was too steep. He had to move in a crouch, using his left foot to push, and his rifle as a crutch. Each step was a negotiation between will and pain. His right foot bore weight only when absolutely necessary, and each time it did, the broken bones shifted and the world went white at the edges. He climbed, yard by yard, stone by stone, using the anger building inside him as fuel for muscles approaching failure. The mortar observer did not hear Childers approaching. The sound of mortars firing and explosions below masked the scrabbling of boots on stone. The observer was focused on his binoculars, watching the impact of each round, speaking into his field telephone. Childers reached a position 15 yards below and to the left of the observer. He raised his M1 Garand, steadied himself against a rock, aimed, and fired. The observer fell sideways. The binoculars tumbled from his hands. The field telephone went silent. Within seconds, the mortar fire that had been pounding the American positions ceased. Childers stood on the Italian hillside, leaning on his rifle, breathing hard. His broken foot throbbed with every heartbeat. Blood from scrapes and cuts mixed with the dirt that covered every inch of his uniform. Below him, the men of Company C began to move. The machine guns were silent. The mortars were silent. The German defensive network that had stopped an entire company's advance had been dismantled by one man with a broken foot and an M1 rifle. The count was precise. 5 German soldiers killed by Childers' individual assault. 2 machine gun positions destroyed. 1 mortar observation post eliminated. The total enemy casualties allowed Company C to resume its advance and capture the ridgeline objective. Childers was evacuated from the hill after the position was secured. Medics carried him down the terraces on a stretcher. He was transported to a field hospital where surgeons set the fractured bones and placed his foot in a plaster cast. The doctors told him the fracture would require 6 to 8 weeks of healing. They told him he was lucky the bones had not pierced the skin during his crawl up the hillside. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was submitted within days. Witness statements were collected from soldiers who had observed portions of Childers' assault from their pinned positions below. Officers documented the destroyed German positions and confirmed the enemy casualties. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place on April 8, 1944, at a ceremony in Naples, Italy. Lieutenant General Jacob Devers presented the medal. Childers stood at attention in his combat-worn uniform while the citation was read aloud. The citation described his actions at Oliveto with precise, understated language. It noted his broken foot. It noted the machine gun positions he destroyed. It noted the mortar observer he killed. The words were accurate but could not convey the reality of crawling up a hillside on a broken foot while machine guns fired and mortar rounds fell. The news of Childers' Medal of Honor carried significance beyond the individual act of valor. Ernest Childers was a full-blooded Creek Indian. He was the first Native American to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. The irony was profound. The Medal of Honor had been created during the Civil War, when the United States government was conducting military campaigns against Native American nations. The decoration had been awarded to soldiers who fought against the very peoples to whom Childers belonged. Now a Creek Indian was receiving that same medal for fighting in defense of the nation that had forcibly removed his ancestors from their homeland. Childers never expressed bitterness about this irony publicly. He understood the history. Every Creek did. The Trail of Tears was not an abstraction for the Muskogee people. It was a living memory passed down through generations. But Childers also understood something that transcended historical grievance. He was fighting against an enemy whose ideology of racial supremacy represented an existential threat to all people, including Native Americans. Whatever wrongs the United States had committed against his people, the alternative, represented by Nazi Germany, was incomparably worse. More practically, Childers was a soldier. He had taken an oath. He had accepted responsibility for the men under his command. When those men were pinned down and dying on an Italian hillside, the question of historical justice was irrelevant. What mattered was the next 30 yards of hillside, the next machine gun position, the next round in his rifle. The 45th Division continued fighting in Italy through the autumn and winter of 1943 and into 1944. The advance was measured in miles gained per week, sometimes per month. Each German defensive line was stronger than the last. The casualties accumulated with relentless consistency. Childers was among those who endured the entire campaign. From the beaches of Sicily to the mountains of Italy, he had been present for every major engagement of the 45th Division. He had seen men die in ways that no human being should witness. He had killed men at ranges where he could see their faces. The liberation of Rome came on June 4th. 1944. The 45th Division entered Rome as part of the Liberation Force, marching through streets lined with cheering Italian civilians. The division fought north through the Italian peninsula through the summer of 1944, before being pulled out in August and reassigned to Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. The division landed on the beaches of the French Riviera on August 15, 1944, and pushed north through the Rhone Valley toward Germany. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The 45th Division had fought from Sicily through Italy to France to Germany. They had spent 511 days in combat, more than most divisions in the European theater. They had suffered over 20,000 casualties, including more than 3,600 killed in action. Ernest Childers survived all of it, from the beaches of Sicily to the heartland of Germany. Through 2 years of combat that killed thousands of his fellow soldiers, the Creek Indian from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, came through alive. Going home meant returning to Oklahoma and to the Creek Nation. Childers came back to a community that had sent its young men to war and received too many of them home in flag-draped coffins. Native Americans had served in World War II at a higher per capita rate than any other ethnic group in the United States. Approximately 44,000 Native Americans served in the military during the war, out of a total population of less than 350,000. The reasons for this disproportionate service were complex. Economic necessity played a role. Cultural factors also contributed. Many Native American cultures had strong warrior traditions that valued military service. For the Creek, whose history included centuries of warfare, military service connected young men to a tradition that predated the United States itself. But there was also something less easily defined: a desire to prove that Native Americans were full participants in the national community, despite being treated as second-class citizens for generations. A willingness to fight and die for the abstract promise of equality, even when that promise had not been fulfilled. Childers embodied all of these motivations without articulating any of them. He was not a political man. He lived his beliefs rather than proclaiming them. He served. He fought. He led. He earned the highest military decoration his country could bestow, and then he came home and continued serving. After the war, Childers remained in the military. He transitioned from the National Guard to the regular army and continued his career as a professional officer. He served during the Korean War. He continued to advance in rank, eventually reaching the grade of lieutenant colonel. The same qualities that had carried him up the hill at Oliveto served him in the longer, slower campaign of a military career. He served the Army for over 20 years, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. In retirement, Childers returned to Oklahoma and to the Creek Nation. He became active in tribal affairs, serving his community with the same dedication he had shown in military service. He worked with veterans organizations, helping Native American veterans navigate the VA system. He attended ceremonial functions and spoke to young people about service and responsibility. The Creek Nation recognized Childers as one of its most distinguished members. His Medal of Honor was a source of pride for the entire Muskogee people, a tangible symbol of Creek courage and resilience that connected the warriors of the present to those of the past. Childers received numerous additional recognitions throughout his later life. The state of Oklahoma honored him with awards and proclamations. In 1966, the Army named a building at Fort Benning, Georgia, in his honor. Childers Hall at the home of the infantry school served as a reminder to every infantry officer who passed through its doors. The 45th Infantry Division maintained its connection to Childers through reunions and memorial events. Veterans who had served with him remembered the quiet lieutenant who had crawled up the hill at Oliveto while they lay pinned below. They remembered the sound of his M1 Garand firing, the explosions of his grenades, the sudden silence when the machine guns stopped. These veterans grew older. Their numbers diminished year by year. The reunions grew smaller. The living memory of the 45th Division's campaigns faded as the men who had experienced them passed away. Childers outlived most of his contemporaries. He reached old age with the quiet dignity that had characterized his entire life. He did not seek publicity. He did not write memoirs. He lived in Oklahoma, close to the land and the people that had produced him. His health declined in his later years. The broken foot that had never healed properly caused chronic pain that worsened with age. The accumulated physical toll of 2 years of infantry combat manifested in ailments that could never be fully treated. Ernest Childers died on March 17, 2005, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was 87 years old. He was buried at Floral Haven Memorial Gardens in Broken Arrow, the town where he had been born. His funeral was attended by family, friends, veterans, and representatives of the Creek Nation. Military honors were rendered. The flag was folded and presented. Taps echoed across the cemetery. The Medal of Honor that Ernest Childers received in 1944 represented more than individual valor. It represented the service of 44,000 Native Americans who fought in World War II. It represented the warrior tradition of the Creek Nation that had survived removal, dispossession, and cultural assault. It represented the willingness of a people who had been wronged by their own government to fight and die for the principles that government claimed to embody. And it represented one specific moment on one specific hillside in Italy, a moment when a young Creek Indian with a broken foot looked up a slope covered by machine guns and mortar fire and decided to climb. Not because he was ordered to, not because he calculated the odds. He climbed because his men were dying, and he could do something about it, and there was no one else to do it. The hill at Oliveto has returned to its peacetime character. The olive trees have grown back. The terraces have been restored. There is no monument at the site. No plaque marks the spot where Childers destroyed the machine gun positions. The landscape has absorbed the violence and returned to its natural state. But the records remain. The official citations and the witness statements and the unit histories. The Medal of Honor in its case. The names spoken at Creek ceremonies and military memorials. Ernest Childers, 2nd Lieutenant, United States Army. Medal of Honor, Creek Nation. A quiet man who climbed a hill on a broken foot because his men needed him to, and there was no one else. Perhaps that is the most important truth about courage. It does not require perfect circumstances. It does not wait for ideal conditions. It does not demand a sound body or a clear path or a reasonable chance of success. It appears when it appears, in men and women who did not know what they were capable of until the world demanded everything they had. The world demanded everything Ernest Childers had on a hillside near Oliveto. He gave it on a broken foot. He gave it with a rifle and grenades. He gave it alone. And when it was done, 150 men who had been pinned down and dying were alive and moving again, because one Creek Indian from Oklahoma had decided that the hill was going to be climbed regardless of what his broken bones had to say about it.